All right, this is going to be a snappy overview of your second assignment in this class, which is the Assessment Audit 2. We're going to be focusing on curriculum and the role of assessment inside of curriculum this time. So to begin, I'd like you to take a really long look at these three images. I'm going to explain them in a minute, but hit pause and just think about the similarities and differences that you're noticing. What are some patterns you're seeing across these? What do they share? Okay, I hope you've taken a second to do that. I just want to walk through it and sort of give you some subtext. On the left here, what you see is what's sometimes called the instructional triangle. And that is, sometimes it's referred to as I, you, and it, right? So the teacher, the student, and the curriculum, or the content, if you will. In the middle there, you're seeing an image from the CPS assessment framework that you read for the week of the 14th. And you can see that, again, it looks really quite similar, right? You have quality instruction, the teacher. You have formative and summative assessment, what the student has learned. And then you have expectations for student learning as well, the standards in the curriculum. And then to the right, you have an image that's drawn from a research article on doing curriculum alignment. And you can see these arrows pointing between learning objectives, assessments, and instructional activities. And so what's the point? You're wondering what's the so what? The so what is notice how interconnected all of these pieces are, right? They're not just three things in a wheel. They're all dependent on one another, and they all feed off one another. And as you can see from those arrows, really coherence is determined by the alignment between these components, right? We can't have good assessments that meet learning objectives unless we've got clear ideas about clear standards, our instructional activities aligned to them. Just as we can't have high expectations or monitor quality teaching if we don't have teachers monitoring assessment data, there aren't clear ideas about what students should learn and be able to do. So I say that also, and I present another triangle because I also want you to think about the fact that a curriculum is not a given. Just because a curriculum exists and names standards, it has assessments, it has good instructional activities, it doesn't mean it actually, in and of itself, is enough. Right? So if you can see at the top of this triangle, it says written curriculum. What's on paper, right? We've all begun planning, whether it's a lesson or a unit, and that's the written curriculum, right? Then there's the taught curriculum. Sometimes we refer to this as the intention versus enactment gap. That is, what's written on paper may not be what's enacted in classrooms, whether because not all the material is covered, or the material covered is different, or because the quality of it doesn't match. These are all variables that might affect or cause a gap between what was intended and what was enacted. And then finally, what was tested, the assessment piece. Is what's assessed actually reflective of what was taught and what was the curriculum intended to do? So because of that, because we might have gaps between what we intend to do, what we do, and then when we ask students to demonstrate for us, there really needs to be an emphasis on ensuring that the work we're doing actually leads to the outcomes we want. So again, if you see this diagram, is what our objectives, our goals, if you will, are they reflected in the assessments? Do the assessments match what we're intending for students to learn and be able to do, right? Same thing with the instructional activities. Are the things that we are doing in the classroom reflective of, representative of, even in support of students' ability to demonstrate those things independently on assessments, right? They all feed into one another. And you can stop and you can imagine that if your instructional activities have nothing to do with the assessments, or what you assess students is completely different than what you intend to, why there would be a difficulty in enacting what we would call a viable curriculum. That is, one that's truly up to standard for all students. That is, it meets the needs of students. It keeps them on track for college and career. So our goal is really to mind this gap, if you will, between these three of these components, and is to sort of make sense of how they interact with one another. That's what I really want you to do. I want you to think about this idea around alignment, coherence, balance, and rigor as it is in instruction with assessment, as we saw from the first day. Assessment is a part of instruction, right? So we want to understand the relationships between curriculum and assessment and to make sense of them and how they work in a real curricular document. And then the end goal here is not judgment. Like I said in the document, I don't want you, the goal here isn't for you to judge whether your instructor's curriculum is good or bad. It's really trying to understand and appreciate the complexity. I want to give you some insight into the kind of challenges that you're going to face as a practicing teacher, as well as the opportunities. So, here's what you're going to need. You're going to need a unit plan, obviously. You're going to need to talk to your mentor teacher about that. And I would suggest one of two options. One is to pick the current unit that your mentor teacher is currently teaching, right? You're somewhat familiar with it because you're watching it take place. Another option is the one they're going to do next. That will give you some opportunity to sort of get ahead. A third option is to pick one from the spring when you'll be student teaching as well. So get a unit plan, get the assessments, for sure get the summative assessments, get as many of the formative or diagnostic or other kinds of assessments as you can. And then I'd also get access to any other materials that will assist the process. That includes things like individual lessons, it might be the texts that are used in it, might be any handout, etc. Now you also need a couple things for the analysis. You'll need the relevant content standards. These are likely going to be the same ones you use for assessment audit number 1. So the content standards, whether the Common Core, whether the state level, that match your content area. And then the rigor matrix as well, which is also from the first one. You're going to want to use that to conduct the rigor piece. All right, I have 4 suggestions about how to get started on this. Inside the assignment sheet, you're going to see I lay out the questions I think you should answer. There's 4 chunks. There's alignment, coherence, balance, and rigor. And how you go about, I told you that you have a couple different ways about going about organizing the response. That's in the assignment as well. But I want to give you 4 ways, I think, to enter the assignment. So collect the materials. And I think the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to use some foundational pieces to look at the bigger picture. And I think there's 4 different foundations you could use. The first is to look at the unit's stated learning goals or outcomes. That is, your teacher is going to say, typically on a unit plan, you're going to say, this is what students should know and be able to do. Sometimes it's identified as essential knowledge, essential skills, essential understanding. It may just say learning objectives or unit goals. That's what you're looking for. You're going to take a look at those unit goals, and you're going to look at the assessments in related to those unit goals and say, well, what do you see in terms of what's actually being assessed versus what is stated, right? And to what extent? Another way in, you could focus on the content, right? So you could look at what the unit's about, its core knowledge, its focus, and look at the assessments to what extent it aligns with the kind of knowledge being assessed. The other piece, and this is connected to the learning goals, is to use the unit's stated standards. Typically on the first or second page of the unit, it'll list the standards that are being addressed or prioritized in the unit. You could use those and go through the documents that you collect to see to what extent are these standards being taken up in the unit. And then finally, the unit's stated or implied rigor level. Using the rigor matrix, take a look at the assessments and say, what does the unit appear to be doing and what is it actually doing? So that's 4 different ways in: the goals, the content, the standards, or the rigor. And basically take that documentation, use it as a set of criteria, right? And then use that criteria to look through the materials and say, to what extent is it actually addressing these things? How is it addressing those things? And that's where I'd begin.